Welcome to Harmony of Wisdom. In this video, we will explore the connection between original sin in Christianity and craving, or greed, in Buddhism. By reading the story of Genesis in the light of the second noble truth revealed by the Buddha, we will try to better understand the authentic meaning of original sin. We will reveal it in a new light, which you have probably never considered, and which will focus primarily on the craving to satisfy one's ego. Precisely for this reason, I invite you to stay with us until the end and let us know in the comments what you think. Your opinions are a precious asset for the growth of the channel and for the spiritual journey of all those who read them. Well, let's start with the story of original sin, narrated in the book of Genesis in chapter 3. The serpent was the most cunning of all the wild animals that God had made, and he said to the woman, "Is it true that God said, 'You must not eat from any tree of the garden'?" The woman replied to the serpent, "We can eat the fruit of the trees in the garden, but God said of the fruit of the tree that is in the middle of the garden, 'You must not eat it, and you must not touch it, otherwise you will die.' But the serpent said to the woman, 'You will not die at all. Indeed, God knows that the day you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil.' Then the woman saw that the tree was good for food, pleasant to the eyes, and desirable for gaining wisdom, took of its fruit and ate. Then she also gave some to her husband, who was with her, and he also ate it." Evidently, it is impossible to exhaust in a single video the immensity of the meanings present in this text. By entering into dialogue with the second noble truth revealed by the Buddha, which recognizes craving as the main cause of human suffering, we will delve into two fundamental points. Point 1. Desire, as a constitutive aspect of the human being. Point 2. The illusion, which does not make us see reality for what it is, and makes us believe we have no limits. Let's begin to explore the desire that characterizes every human being. In the story of Genesis, we see that this desire immediately comes up against a limit. The human being, after an internal battle symbolized by the dialogue with the snake, decides to overcome this limit and satisfy his desire. Knowing good and evil represents the totality of knowledge. It represents everything. Man desires to know everything. He thirsts for infinite knowledge. History proves it. Over the past 50 years, for example, we have made incredible progress in medical and scientific research. In the perspective of the book of Genesis, man is made in the image and likeness of God. Therefore, he has within himself the infinite, the absolute characteristics of divinity. We can really say that the peculiarity of man is that of being infinite desire. Man desires to be like God, wish to live forever. So if God created him in his image, with this infinite thirst for knowledge and life, why does he place a limit on man? To answer this question, it may be useful to read a text that describes the second noble truth on the origin of suffering, from the book The Teaching of the Buddha, by the Bukkyo Dendo Kyokai. I'll leave you the references in the description. But first, if you haven't already done so, I invite you to subscribe to the channel and click on the bell. Thank you with all my heart. As for the cause of human suffering, there is no doubt that they arise from the appetites of the physical body and the illusions of worldly passions. The origin of these passions is rooted in all intense desires related to instincts. These desires, based on an imperious desire to live, try to take over everything that is perceived as desirable, even death. This is the truth about the origin of suffering. If, as is clearly evident from the second noble truth, revealed by the Buddha, the origin of suffering is this desire to take possession of everything, which we can call craving, then the command to God in the book of Genesis, who places a limit on man, precisely to preserve him from the suffering that can derive from this eager and boundless desire. Furthermore, it is reality itself that unequivocally shows us that the limit, rather than being imposed by God, is part of man's very nature. Can we really know the totality of the mysteries of existence and the universe? Isn't it true that science itself reaches a point where it cannot provide all the answers? Furthermore, how can we not accept the limit of biological life? For as long as humanity has existed, there has never been a man who has not experienced death. If we do not accept that we are limited in living and knowing, then we do not accept ourselves and risk self-destruction. It is precisely from this self-destruction that the God of Genesis wants to preserve us. If, as is true, limits are part of our essence, why don't we recognize them? Why do we want to break them down, overcome them, even if this causes us pain and suffering? The answer introduces us to point 2, the illusion, which does not make us see reality. We are deceived. We believe the absurd promises of an inner voice, represented by the serpent, and we behave accordingly. Obviously, the illusion we give credence to makes all limits disappear, denying them. Let's see, in detail, how this voice acts in our mind. First of all, the serpent reports only the negative part of God's command. Is it true that God said, "You must not eat from any tree of the garden"? He voluntarily omits to report the positive command, that is, that the human being could eat from all the trees in the garden. Only one was excluded. Not only, the snake exaggerates the prohibition, extending it to all the trees in the garden. Already from this, we can understand how our mind works. The negative is stronger than the positive. The negative wins over the positive. It is so powerful to the point that it crushes the positive, even if the positive is infinitely greater. All the trees in the garden, yes. Just one, no. Where does our attention fall? Right on that one tree, which it is best not to eat. If we decide to listen to this voice and try to dialogue with it, it will be increasingly difficult to get the better of it. The response that Eve gives to the serpent is emblematic. We may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden, but of the fruit of the tree that is in the midst of the garden, God has said, "You must not eat it, and you must not touch it. Otherwise you will die." Despite the admirable attempt to report the correct words spoken by God, if we choose to enter into dialogue with the voice of the serpent, its logic takes over our mind and makes us see a distorted reality. Here is the demonstration. God had never said not to eat from the tree that is in the middle of the garden. In verse 9 of chapter 2 of Genesis, we clearly read that, in the middle of the garden, there was the tree of life, from which one could eat freely. The tree that was best not to eat was that of the knowledge of good and evil. What happens here? Change the center. If before the center was life, or rather the most important thing for the human being, now the center becomes the prohibition. That limit that begins to be a little too cumbersome, to the point that it captures all our attention. But that is not all. God never said that the tree could not be touched, but only that it could not be eaten. As the voice of the serpent exaggerated God's command, thus the human being, represented here by Eve, exaggerates the command by even adding the prohibition on touching. An ancient rabbinic saying says that exaggerating the command is the prerequisite for transgressing it. In other words, what was initially a more than acceptable limit, having all the trees except one available, is now starting to become an unsustainable limit. The voice of the serpent, by now, understands that the path is clear and can play its last winning cards to make us see a completely illusory reality, but which in our eyes will be good, beautiful, and desirable. The Remove Fear card, and the card of Giving Pleasure. You won't die at all. Man has always feared death. All culture, all science, technology, ultimately, has the objective of keeping death as far away as possible, or at least exercising it. Death is considered a taboo, something that is better not to talk about, better not to think about. We have excluded it from our lives to such an extent that we forget about its very existence. Our inner voice pushes us to believe that we will live forever, that death does not concern us. By eliminating the threat of death, this voice can finally give us pleasure, showing us the sublime charm of living without limits. Indeed, God knows that the day you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. And here's the pleasure: becoming like God, acquiring absolute knowledge. What more could you want? This boundless desire cannot help but collide with harsh reality. Man will necessarily have to deal with his own limits, facing pain and suffering, which are specific to the human condition, and not a punishment for having transgressed a divine command, which instead had the aim of protecting man, to warn him of danger. Rather than original sin, we should speak of original ignorance. The Buddhist vision, contained in the Second Noble Truth, is clear in this sense. Human beings make decisions based on ignorance, caused by the illusions of our mind, which prevent us from seeing reality and accepting it as it is. The first thing that we need to accept is precisely the transitory and ephemeral nature of our human condition, and of everything that surrounds us. This means accepting the limit. We can't live forever. We cannot know everything, experience everything. Of course, it would be much simpler if we didn't have this boundless desire within us, which pushes us to never be satisfied, to always go further, to always want more. Yet, according to the story of Genesis, God created us in His image and likeness. Therefore, it is more than legitimate that the human being has an infinite desire. The desire to be like God. But which God are we talking about? In the first chapter of the book of Genesis, God creates man in His image and likeness, and, after having entrusted all creation into His hands, on the seventh day He retires, ceasing all work. The first to set Himself a limit is God Himself. After completing creation, which culminates with the human being, He takes a step back and leaves room for man, inviting him to continue the creative work. It is this God that the human being is invited to resemble. Giving up the illusions of superpower and opening up to meeting others. Resembling a God who makes limits a place of relationship and exchange, rather than of abuse and destruction. The desire to be like God, which man has within himself, is right. The problem is that he directs it towards a completely distorted image of God, precisely from that inner voice that deceives him, which makes him believe in a God who has everything and everyone in His hands. A God who is like a severe judge, who condemns. A jealous God who does not want man to become like Him. In Jesus Christ, we have the definitive revelation that God is exactly the opposite. He is a God who, first, takes on the limit, becoming man, just like us. A God who, rather than harming a single hair on man's hair, prefers to die Himself, giving Himself totally into our hands. We want to be like God? Well, this is God. This is the man. If this video has given you some food for thought, let me know with a like or write it in the comments. I also invite you to watch this video, which compares the concept of karma in Buddhism with divine justice in Christianity. Hello, and God bless you.